What's going on, everybody? Happy Monday. Welcome into this bonus edition of the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. One of my favorite episodes every single year. We're going to be going over the trade deadline, specifically who Green Bay could be targeting, who doesn't make sense, who Green Bay maybe could trade off of their own roster. I think this is a very interesting discussion from a Packers standpoint. We will dig into all of it. Before we get there, shout out to our brand new Pack a Day podcast YouTube members, Josh Jacobs, Jim Jonas, Tony Bertucci, Rational Games, and Tony Williams. Appreciate you guys signing up. Yes, Josh Jacobs is the name, but that's amazing. I'm sure it is very much the running back. But either way, thank you guys so much for being here. And thank you for becoming brand new Pack a Day podcast YouTube members. Let's get into all of this. Let's dive in right away because, like I said, this is one of my favorite topics every year. And we're going to go over some realistic options for Green Bay. Let's remember, first of all, a couple things. And I think these are important things to point out. More often than not, the best deadline deals are the ones that you do not do. There have not been very many deadline deals that have been good for teams, that have worked out great for teams, at least the teams that are acquiring those players. Look at it from a Green Bay point of view. Maybe Emmanuel Sanders, when they were trying to get him, would have been somebody that could have helped. I think back in the day, some of those maybe Tony Gonzalez, Jason Taylor trades, if they ever came to fruition, could have helped Green Bay, right? Those would have been nice to haves. But more recently, Will Fuller, that would have gone horribly wrong. Suspended and then basically out of the league. They would have gotten no ROI. In fact, much negative ROI on that deal for anything that they would have given up for him. That would have been a brutal trade. More recently, Chase Claypool, the wide receiver, we're trying to give a second-round pick for Chase Claypool. That pick probably turned out to be potentially, I guess, maybe a Luke Musgrave, right? But potentially Jaden Reed. And with that, all the deals that they did to move down with that pick, they could have lost Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, and Carl Brooks in exchange for Chase Claypool by trading that second-round pick for him. And maybe even more than that because they would have needed to beat Chicago out in that deal. So they could have traded that second-round pick away. Again, that ultimately became Reed, Wicks, and Brooks. And they would have probably had to add draft capital or other player compensation on top of that to sweeten the deal to get ahead of Chicago in that situation. That would have been a nightmare deal for Green Bay. So just remember, if Green Bay does not make a trade at the deadline, it may end up being a huge blessing in disguise, just like it was with Will Fuller and just like it was with Chase Claypool. And I think the other thing that's worth pointing out here is it is worth remembering just how valuable draft capital can be. The golden goose, the best thing that you can have is a very talented player on a rookie deal. It is the creme de la creme of what GMs want to acquire. If you can have Jaden Reed on a 4-year deal making next to nothing, is that a beautiful contract to have? If you can have Tucker Kraft on a 4-year deal making next to nothing, man, is that a valuable contract to have. Zach Tom at right tackle making nothing. Rasheed Walker at left tackle making nothing. Sean Ryan at right guard making nothing. Like, we can go on and on. But all of these deals where you have key players in key positions that are really freaking good, not making any significant salaries, cap money, like that is massive for your roster. That allows you to go out and sign guys like Xavier McKinney. That allows you to go sign guys like Josh Jacobs. Like, these are big time sort of deals that, Green Bay is able to acquire because of the fact that you have a situation where you have some of these super cheap deals on your salary cap, right? And you have really talented players that aren't making anything yet. And it's even going to be more important for Green Bay down the stretch because they're going to have to sign some of these players, right, to big contracts like a Zach Tom long-term. So you're going to need to restock the cupboard with some really cheap, valuable assets. So these future 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th round picks that may not seem like anything right now have the potential to become some very valuable assets for Green Bay down the road. And we have seen Goody do a tremendous job drafting on day 2 and day 3 of the draft. So it is very easy just to start throwing away 4th and 5th and 6th round picks like they're candy, like they're nothing, like they don't matter, but they can matter a ton. And you have to have those players on cheap deals to continue to stock your roster with depth, with talent, with versatility, and to be able to re-sign the guys that you have to big contracts so that you can let other players walk because you have all of this young talent that is still making relatively cheap money. So those picks are very, very valuable. They may not seem like it at the moment, might seem like, what is a 4th round pick going to do? It can be extremely important to have those picks down the road. So that draft capital, very, very valuable, even if it may not seem like it at the time. Next, let's take a look at what positions could make sense for Green Bay, what positions they would potentially like to trade for. Let's just go through it really quick because I think this is fairly obvious, but quarterback, no need, right? You've got Jordan Love, you've got Malik Willis, you're good. Running back, no need. You've got Jacobs, you've got Wilson, you've got Christopher Brooks, and at some point, you would expect to get Marshawn Lloyd back. No real need there. Tight end, we did find out that Luke Musgrave had some surgery, so he is probably still going to be recovering for a bit, but they do expect him back at some point. Could you maybe make a small ad for a tight end just to give you some versatility now in case something would happen to a Tucker Kraft? Maybe, but you still have Ben Sims. You've got John Fitzpatrick on the roster. You've got Messiah Swinson on the practice squad, and Musgrave is expected to be back at some point. And Tucker Kraft's going to be that guy, right? So I don't really see tight end. Offensive line, I think they have the depth. Josh Myers should be coming back, I would think after the bye week. And hopefully you have the depth that you need. You've got a Dillard. You've got, a Jacob Monk. I think you're probably pretty set. And teams don't often trade away offensive linemen. I know we just saw Cam Robinson to the Vikings, but I don't think Green Bay is going to be in that conversation for offensive linemen. Let's go to the ones on defense that don't make sense. And I'll just say, I don't think they're going to make any moves at special teams. They've already brought in Brandon McManus. They've got the punter. I don't think they're making a long snapper trade. Even if they were, I don't think it's probably worth it for us to discuss it, right? So let's kind of go over the positions on defense that don't make sense. Safety, you've got Bullard, Evan Williams, Xavier McKinney. You've got Zane Anderson, Katano Ladapo. Probably no need at safety, right? You've got off-ball linebacker. Would you always like some sort of upgrade? Maybe, but I don't see it with Artie Quay getting a ton of time. Edgerrin Cooper, you're trying to get more time for. McDuffie and Wilson have been more than solid, although Wilson had a tough game this past week. And you're still trying to find ways to get Tyron Hopper on the field. And you just went out and got Jamin Davis, right? As a practice squad guy, a potential guy there too. So I don't see off-ball linebacker, which leaves us with 3 potential positions that I think Green Bay may have some interest in. I'll say 3 because defensive end / defensive tackle are 2 different ones. But what I really want to say here is pass rusher. Like whether it's at defensive end or defensive tackle, they could use a little bit more pass rush juice. So pass rusher, whether it's at defensive end or defensive tackle, and then potentially corner. I think with Jair's, injury issues as of late that you can't always count on him, and just not really getting the ROI on Eric Stokes that you would have liked, or just the expectation going even into this season. And Carrington Valentine has not really earned that job so far. Keyshawn Nixon, I don't think you would have this huge desire to play him maybe as much as he has to be played. Or even in a game like this where you're missing Jair, where Keyshawn Nixon needs to be your number 1 corner, you're probably looking at something that's a little bit of a problem in that situation. So gaining a little bit more depth there, I think would definitely make some sense. So if we're looking at it, what positions would Green Bay most maybe want to acquire? Pass rusher, whether it's at defensive end or defensive tackle, and some corner depth, or maybe even a starter at either of those positions that can really maybe get you to the point that you want to be and get you a little bit more pass rush, get you a little bit of coverage on the back end. So then we have to look at what teams could possibly be selling at the deadline. New England Patriots, Miami Dolphins, Cleveland Browns, Tennessee Titans, Jacksonville Jaguars, the Las Vegas Raiders, the New York Giants, Dallas Cowboys, New Orleans Saints, and Carolina Panthers. Those 10 teams are the ones that I think would make the most sense that they could potentially be trading players away. So today, let's take a look at what players on those teams at positions of need, corner, defensive line, whether it's edge or defensive tackle, specifically pass rushers, could make some sense for Green Bay. There are 9 players that I have identified that I think Green Bay at least could have some conversations on, or maybe have at least some inkling of interest in if the deal made sense for both sides. So we're going to go through those right now. We're going to start in New England. Cornerback, Jonathan Jones. All right. He has about $4.4 million remaining on this year's contract. Now, maybe you could get New England to eat some of that so Green Bay doesn't have to take quite as much of that on. Or maybe you trade like an Eric Stokes in return so they have to, that a little bit evens itself out a little bit more. But either way, you probably don't want to take that on. He's got a 60, at least the full thing at this point, 66.8 PFF grade. He's allowed 17 completions on 23 attempts in his direction, 255 yards total, which isn't a ton. 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, 1 pass breakup, does give up a 128.9 passer rating, has 1 penalty. He's been fine. He's been solid. He's been consistent. Could he be somebody that would be an upgrade at outside corner? Yes. Could you give up, again, if you wanted them to take maybe Eric Stokes' contract, could you give up an Eric Stokes and a late day 3 pick for somebody like Jonathan Jones to get an upgrade at corner? Allow him to start opposite Jair Alexander and then have Bullard and Nixon both as options in the slot? That could make some sense. The contract's not horrible. He's a free agent after this year. You could potentially get a compensatory pick back for him if he signs somewhere for a decent deal in free agency. My guess is he'd probably be a little extra motivated coming from a team that is not successful, going to a team that's competing for the playoffs. I could see that maybe working. It's not like a 1A type of deal. I think Green Bay may want New England to take on a little bit more of that contract. But again, some sort of late round pick for Jonathan Jones to get that upgrade at corner, I think that could be something that, again, could make sense for the Packers. Next one, we're going to go to Miami. We're going to go to the defensive line, and that is Calais Campbell. Now, Campbell is 38 years old. The beauty of this deal is that he has just over $1 million-ish remaining for the remainder of this season on a 1-year deal. This is somebody that is looking to play for a contender. Who knows if he plays even past this season? The other beauty of this is he has an 83.4 PFF grade so far this year and has been playing really good football. He has 18 pressures, 2 sacks, 13 hurries, and he also has a 79.4 run defense grade. You're taking somebody that has a ton of experience, putting him in that rotation on the interior of the defensive line. You can even kick him outside a little bit. You can rotate him in with Kenny Clark and Devontae Wyatt, Carl Brooks, and Calais Campbell. Probably feel much better about the interior of that line. And you're not going to have to give up anything. Miami knows that they're not really competing anymore this year. They'll probably take any sort of late day 3 selection. They get off of the remainder of that contract for this year. They get something in return, and Campbell's a free agent next year. Now, again, he's 38 years old. You'd have to limit his snaps, but Green Bay's in a position where they can limit his snaps. In fact, he hasn't really needed to be limited in Miami so far. So you're now putting him probably in a better position that when he is in the game, he can go out and maybe even be better than what he's shown in Miami. And again, an 83.4 grade. He would grade out per PFF as one of their best defensive players so far in the season, despite being at 38 years old. And you're getting somebody that's hungry, wants to get that Super Bowl ring, and wants to come in and get that one last shot at a Super Bowl potentially. So don't mind that at all. I don't care about the age. He's a freak of nature. You know, he's 6'8", 280 pounds, whatever it might be. Like, he is a phenomenal player. And I think adding him into that rotation could really help Green Bay, both from a run defense standpoint and a little bit of pass rush as well. I'm going to stay in Miami. Corner, Kendall Fuller of the Miami Dolphins again. Under $1 million remaining on his contract this year. He would have 1 year, $7 million on his contract next year, but it would be non-guaranteed. So what this amounts to is you're paying him next to nothing for the remainder of this year, and then you get a team option next year. If he plays great the remainder of this year and you want to keep him for 1 year, $7 million, which you could do a simple restructure to basically cut that in half so it's less and then you pay it more in the future, or you can just release him with no penalty whatsoever. So you have basically a team option on Kendall Fuller for 2025, which is kind of a beautiful thing if you kind of think about it. He's got a 72.0 grade per PFF so far, 10 completions on 19 attempts his way, 52.6%, only 128 yards given up, 1 touchdown, no picks, 4 pass breakups, 1 penalty, a 91.6 passer rating. He's primarily played on the outside this year, but he has played in the slot in the past. I think you would probably put him outside opposite Jair. Again, give Bullard and Nixon the ability to mix and match a little bit on the inside. But if you wanted to play some Nixon on the outside and Fuller in the slot in some specific situations, you could theoretically do that as well. And it would give you some additional depth and flexibility if Jair would be out and you need to mix and match a little bit more. I think he would be a very smart addition for this Packers defensive backfield. And again, very minimal contract here. Miami's probably willing to get off of him knowing that they're not competing this year. Again, he's going to be going into his 30s, so the contract next year is not a huge deal for Miami one way or the other. And so again, I think this would be something that the Dolphins would very much consider. A bonus on Campbell and Fuller is that Green Bay plays Miami later this year. So you're also potentially taking players away that you would have to face later this year, which has a slight bonus to it as well. Let's talk about the Cleveland Browns. Corner Greg Newsome, 24 years old. Just over $1 million left on his contract about this year, right around there. He would have, though, a $13.37 million guaranteed contract next year. That is a big-time contract that you would be committing to. Furthermore, he's not been great this year. 52.3 PFF grade. I went and watched his tape. It's not been pretty. He did have a 74.5 grade this past week and had one of his best games of the season. When thrown at 36 times, he's given up 24 completions, a 66.7% completion percentage, 360 yards, 3 touchdowns, no picks, 2 pass breakups, a 127.1 passer rating. It has not been pretty. Now, the good news here is that you could get him probably for nothing. Like Cleveland probably more than anything just wants off of that guaranteed deal next year. In fact, one of the ideas that I floated in a live show was, how about Eric Stokes for Greg Newsome? What that gives you is some savings this year by getting off of Eric Stokes for Green Bay. It allows you to probably have a slight upgrade at the position right now. And Cleveland's big advantage here is that Stokes is a free agent next year. They can get off of that guaranteed contract from Greg Newsome, so they don't have to pay him $13 million guaranteed money. Now, Green Bay would be taking a risk, right? They're betting on his upside at still 24 years old, that they could get him in Green Bay, sort of revitalize him a little bit. He's played outside and in the slot, coming off his best game of the season, and that you can figure out a way to utilize him better. But if it goes poorly and if he's terrible, now you're committing $13.4 million to him next year, guaranteed, that you cannot get off of unless you trade him somewhere else and some other team is willing to take that on, which is probably less likely if he doesn't work out in Green Bay the remainder of this year. So there's risk there. The, again, potential reward is that you're buying him on the cheap. You probably have to give up next to nothing. You might even be able to just swap him for an Eric Stokes. Again, Cleveland's big upside there is they get off of the guaranteed contract. Green Bay takes on some risk, but there is some upside there as well. Ideal? Probably not. Impossible? I would say also probably not. It's at least worth thinking about maybe having that conversation. Let's go to Tennessee. Edge rusher Arden Key, 28 years old. He'd have a little bit over $1 million left on his contract this year, so nothing there. He'd have $7 million on a contract next year, but it would be non-guaranteed. So again, basically that team option, right? If they like him this year, he plays well, they can keep him for 1 year, $7 million next year. If they don't, release him. It's non-guaranteed, no problem whatsoever. 71.5 grade per PFF, 19 pressures, 4 sacks, 13 hurries on the season so far. So a little bit of a different player, a little bit extra juice, another player that you can rotate in. Maybe you give up a Brenton Cox in a late round pick for something to open up that spot on the defensive line or at the edge rusher position and just give you a different piece to rotate in and maybe give you a little bit more juice in that pass rush. Don't hate the idea. Don't hate the idea at all. Another one, we're going to go to the Raiders of Las Vegas. We're going to go corner Jack Jones, only 27 years old. He would only have about $500K left on his contract this year. He'd have a $1 million deal next year, non-guaranteed. So you get him super cheap this year and super cheap next year. He's only 27 years old. Has a 61.5 PFF grade so far. He has given up 24 completions on 36 throws his way, 66.7%. He's given up 4 touchdowns, did have a pick 6 this past week. You may have seen it. It was pretty awesome. He jumped a little bubble screen and just took it to the house. He's done that. That's the second time he's done that in his career, by the way. He does have 5 pass breakups on the year, but he's giving up 117.2 passer rating and does have 5 penalties. The nice thing, he's young, he's talented, and his contract is next to nothing, and you probably don't have to give up a ton to go get him. The bad news is there's sort of some risk reward here when it comes to his play. He's got the pass breakups, he's got the pick, but he's given up a lot of touchdowns and a lot of penalties, and he's sort of been that level of inconsistent throughout the entirety of his career. So again, plus side, no big draft compensation or financial compensation to go get him. But again, his play has been a little bit more erratic. The next one is one I really like. Defensive end Carl Granderson for the New Orleans Saints. 28 years old. He'd only have about $500K remaining on his deal this year. So you get him super cheap this year. He would have a contract next year for $7.73 million that would be fully guaranteed. So you would have to have him next year on that guaranteed deal. He would then have 2 additional years on that contract for $12.75 million each year, but those would be non-guaranteed. So it's basically you get him super cheap this year. You got a 1 year, $7.73 million the following year, and then it's probably done after that. Still only 28 years old. 74.3 PFF grade so far this year. He already has 32 pressures on the season, 5 sacks, 26 hurries, and he has a 63.4 run defense grade. Somebody that would definitely give you a little bit more juice at defensive end, and he's been good enough against the run, and you have guys to rotate in. All right, even if you do keep Preston Smith in this situation, Preston Smith and LVN more as your run defenders with Gary and Granderson more as your pass rushers, that could be something that would really work for Green Bay. Again, maybe you give up that one would probably be a little bit more of a mid-round pick. I think you'd have to pay a little bit more for his services. There would, I think, be a lot of interest throughout the league. But I think you're taking on a contract that's not bad, certainly for the remainder of this year, and you're getting a really good edge rusher for the remainder of this year and going into next year. So that was one I would very much be interested in for Green Bay. Another defensive end, we're going to go to Carolina. Jadeveon Clowney, 31 years old, would only have a little bit more than about $1 million remaining on his contract for this year. Would have to pay him $10 million next year, but only $2 million of that is guaranteed. So either you play him for 1 year, $10 million. It's basically kind of like a team option again, or you can release him and only have to pay him $2 million. So it'd basically be like getting him for the remainder of this year for $3 million total. 1 mil this year, 2 mil next year. Or if you wanted, you could keep him on basically a 1 year, $8 million option next year. However you want to view it. His PFF grade, 63.4, only 18 pressures, only 1 sack so far this year. But he had 78 pressures just a season ago. And his run defense has been really good so far with a 72.8 PFF grade on the season. You also have to think Carolina is a unmitigated nightmare. Bringing him into Green Bay, hopefully unlocking him a little bit more and seeing if you can get him back to where he was a season ago where he had 78 pressures, man, it's probably just worth the risk, right? You're going to have to probably battle some other teams for his services. Clowney has never been one for the most part that has really lived up to his expectations, but last year in 2023, he very much did. I think it's worth the flyer. At worst, you get a really solid run defender on the edges. At best, you unlock him and get back to the player he was last year where he was absolutely dominant as a pass rusher. And we're going to stay in Carolina for our last one. J.C. Horn, corner, 25 years old, would have about $1.7 million remaining this year, 12.472 guaranteed next year. I think the issue, one, is that you're obviously have that guarantee next year. That's not really the issue. I think the bigger issue is when you make a trade for J.C. Horn like that, what is he immediately going to want? He's going to want that contract extension. He's going to say, I'm not playing on the 1 year guarantee deal. You just traded for my services. I want a big time 4 or 5 year guaranteed deal. I think that's probably the deal breaker for Green Bay. Now you could trade from this year, hope that he plays well, and then maybe you could trade him next year to another team. So you get him for the 1 year, but that's not the style of deal Green Bay normally likes to do. But maybe Green Bay just really loved J.C. Horn in the draft. Maybe it's a player that they would really covet. Maybe they feel like Jair they're going to have to move on from based on the injury issues, a la what they kind of did with Aaron Jones. And maybe they feel like they need that lockdown corner, like that number one corner moving forward, and they feel like J.C. Horn can be that guy. He's got a 72.7 PFF grade this year, 15 completions on 35 attempts, 42.9% completion percentage, only 192 yards, has given up 3 touchdowns, but has 1 interception, 7 pass breakups, but 5 penalties, a 77.3 passer rating. He's been pretty darn good in Carolina throughout his career. Would be an interesting one, would be a more aggressive deal for Green Bay, but not entirely off the table based on where his contract would be for the remainder of this year. So those are the 9 that I think, at least in the realm of possibility. Jonathan Jones for the Patriots, Calais Campbell for the Dolphins, Kendall Fuller for the Dolphins, Greg Newsome for the Browns, Arden Key for the Titans, Jack Jones for the Raiders, Carl Granderson for the Saints, Jadeveon Clowney for the Panthers, and J.C. Horn for the Panthers. Now let's look at some players Green Bay could trade. There's one name that keeps coming up, Preston Smith. I just don't see a world in which another team is willing to take on his contract. Green Bay could get off of it. It's not the worst deal for another team to take on. It's a small possibility. You're probably looking at getting a 7th round pick in return, something like that. You're probably not going to get much, but if Green Bay wanted to go out and get a Granderson or a Clowney or one of these type of players that they could add to their edge rusher room, maybe they feel like they need to subtract somebody and maybe they get, maybe they trade a, 4th round pick for Granderson, a 3rd round pick for Granderson, or a 5th round pick for 6th round pick for Arden Key, and then they get a 7th rounder in return for Preston Smith. Feeling like they upgraded the position, had to give up a pick, but got a pick back in return. Like I could see them maybe doing something like that, but I think Preston Smith stays. Eric Stokes would be the other one. And again, this would probably be involved with him upgrading the corner position in some other capacity, wanting maybe to give him an opportunity somewhere else. Maybe he's included in the deal for a corner. That gets you a little salary cap relief in the process. Maybe you have to give up a little bit more of a pick, maybe 1 round earlier or something to have them take on Stokes' contract. But the other team would get a 6-7 week look at a former 1st round pick in their building to see if maybe just the change of scenery would help Stokes out. Not the worst case scenario for the team that would be acquiring him. Those would be the 2 that I think would make the most sense. I don't really see much else. I know Andre Dillard's come up a little bit. I think Green Bay's probably better just to keep him on the payroll just in case things happen from a depth standpoint along the offensive line, because it is so hard to find really good depth. Even if it's your 8th, 9th, 10th guy, Green Bay's probably better off just keeping him rather than taking some really late draft pick in return for that sort of deal. Odds of a trade for Green Bay, I'm going to put it right around 25%. I don't think it's super likely, but I definitely don't think it's impossible. What I would do, I'd be calling Miami. I think Kendall Fuller and Calais Campbell, man, if you could get them as some sort of package, it's not really costing you much. Maybe like a 5th round pick for Fuller and Campbell. Man, would I love that. Or maybe a 5th round pick in Stokes for Fuller and Campbell, 5th round pick Stokes and Brenton Cox for Fuller and Campbell, something like that. I think that could make sense for both sides. Again, Miami gets some draft capital, a young player like Brenton Cox. They get a flyer on Eric Stokes to help him out the remainder of this year. Green Bay gets in a Kendall Fuller and a Calais Campbell. I know deals like that generally don't happen, but like even if it's just one of the two, right, I'd very much be interested in either of them. The Panthers, Jadeveon Clowney, I think would definitely make some sense for Green Bay, and the Saints, Carl Granderson. Those would probably be the ones that I'd be looking at. I know people are looking at Max Crosby or, Myles Garrett. I've mentioned Jalen Ramsey in the past. I just don't see Green Bay going in those directions. The Ramsey one, the contract for Miami would be too egregious. I just don't see, again, either team being interested in that based on the contract ramifications. Same thing with Marshawn Lattimore with the Saints. Chase Young could be somebody in New Orleans. I just think Granderson's better. I would just go more aggressively towards Granderson and stay away from Chase Young. So that's kind of the direction I would go there. And again, I don't think Crosby or Myles Garrett are going anywhere, nor do I see, if they do decide to trade either of those guys, I don't see Green Bay being the one that ups the ante enough to outbid any other team that's interested in their services. So those are the 9 that I think would be potentially possible. And again, I would look at Kendall Fuller, Calais Campbell, Jadeveon Clowney, and Carl Granderson as potential, moves for Green Bay that could really legitimately make some sense. All right, that's going to do it for me today. I'll be back with Justice Mosqueda tomorrow morning. Shout out to our Hall of Fame and All-Pro members, Most Hated Minnesotan, PJ Wynn, John Wild, Shea Bradad, Brandon Paletta, Jennifer Wright, Boom Handle, Donald Lee, Lori Lord, Baby QB, David McCluskey, Donald Decker, Dan Miller, Alex Wong, Arnaldo Espinoza, Peter Ritaka, SoCal Pack, Dan Gassford, Jay Zimmerman, B. Brown, Love and Football, and Puerto Rican Packer. I'll see you guys all very soon, but until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.